At the moment of the cross, Lucifer believed he had finally won. He had cornered the king, used the laws of men, and was about to claim his victory. But he was blind to two figures standing just outside his perception: Michael, the enforcer, and Uriel, the witness. They were not there to stop the event, they were there to seal it. They were the guardians of a divine transaction, a cosmic transfer of power that was about to break the gates of Sheol itself. What was this secret transaction, and why did it terrify the throne of shadows? We are about to reveal everything. Welcome to Bible Mysteries. Subscribe now and like this video so you never miss a revelation. It began in a garden, not the garden of agony that was to come, but the first one, the garden of innocence. It was there, among the perfection of a new creation, that a whisper of ruin was spoken. A choice was made, and a shadow fell upon the heart of humanity. But in that same moment of fracture, a promise was also spoken, a quiet, cosmic vow that one day a descendant of that first woman would come. This descendant would confront the very shadow that had caused the fall. From his own throne of shadows, the fallen one, Lucifer, heard this prophecy. He who was once the brightest of the morning stars, now consumed by pride and bitterness, latched onto this promise. He twisted it. He saw it not as a promise of redemption, but as a declaration of war, a threat to his newfound dominion over the earth. And so, his obsession began. For thousands of years he watched, he waited. He was the unseen influence behind the rise and fall of empires. He was the whisper in the ear of kings and the doubt in the heart of prophets. He studied the lines of humanity, searching for any sign of this promised one. He built his own hierarchy, his principalities and powers, all designed for one purpose: to find this seed and ensure it could never fulfill its destiny. He believed he understood the prophecy. He assumed it would be a battle of might, a war of visible power, a clash of armies. He prepared for a king, a conqueror, a warrior who would challenge him with fire and steel. Through the slow march of centuries, the spiritual realm grew tense. The air itself felt thin, charged with an anticipation that was almost painful. Angels in the high courts of heaven watched the tapestry of time, knowing that the threads were converging. The dread was not just felt in the lower realms. It was a profound, silent pause in the heavens. Every song was hushed, every wing was still. They all watched the small, dusty corner of the world, Judea. They watched the birth in a stable, the quiet life of a carpenter, the years of silence. Lucifer grew confused, then anxious. This was not the warrior he expected. This was not the king he had prepared for. Yet the energy of heaven was focusing. The prophecies of ages, the hopes of generations, the entire weight of the divine plan, all began to narrow. It was like a great lens focusing the light of the sun onto a single, precise point in time. That time was now. The final week had arrived. The ancient echo of the promise made in Eden was about to become a deafening roar. The garden was dark. The moon was veiled by high, thin clouds, and the ancient olive trees cast shadows that seemed to twist and writhe. This was Gethsemane. It was here that the first true engagement of the final conflict began. It was not a battle of swords. It was a battle of will. The Son of Man was there, his closest friends asleep only a short distance away. He was alone, and the full weight of what was to come began to press upon him. This was not a human fear. It was a divine spiritual pressure and distress of the soul so profound that the natural world itself seemed to hold its breath. Lucifer did not come himself. He was too proud, still too certain of his own interpretations. Instead, he sent his lieutenants. Lesser principalities, spirits of doubt, fear, and despair, emerged from the shadows. They did not attack his body. They assaulted his mind. They whispered to him, They offered him alternatives. They painted pictures of the suffering to come, not just the physical pain, but the spiritual isolation. They reminded him of the world he could rule, the empires he could command, if he only chose a different path. They magnified the bitterness of the cup he was about to drink. They hissed that his sacrifice was pointless, that humanity was not worth the price, that he would be forsaken by both heaven and earth. This was the pressure point, the hinge upon which all of eternity was turning. And high above, unseen by human eyes, two figures watched. They stood cloaked in divine stillness, observing the struggle from a dimension just beyond the veil. They were Michael and Uriel. Michael, the great archangel, heaven's general, stood with his arms crossed. His form was like compressed lightning, a warrior's presence that vibrated with restrained power. His hand rested on the hilt of a sword that was not yet drawn, a weapon forged in the fires of cosmic justice. He watched the assault on his king, and his entire being strained against the command to hold back. He was waiting. Beside him stood Uriel. He was not a warrior, but a flame of pure analytical light. He was the archangel of revelation, the keeper of the divine mysteries. His eyes, like white fire, pierced the spiritual darkness of the garden. He observed the exchange, the legal and spiritual arguments being thrown at the sun. He was not tense like Michael. He was focused, recording, understanding. He was the witness. They did not intervene. This was not their mandate. Not yet. This was a battle the sun had to face alone. The pressure in the garden became suffocating. The air was too thick to breathe. The spiritual anguish reached its peak. The whispering demons grew louder, more frantic, sensing a possible victory. And then there was silence. The sun rose from his knees. The suffering was still visible upon him, but the conflict in his spirit was resolved. He had made the choice. The whispers of the principalities faltered, their arguments turning to ash. They recoiled from the sudden, unassailable resolve. From their vantage point, Michael and Uriel saw the shift. The first test was over. The spiritual assault had failed. Michael's hand relaxed slightly on his sword. Uriel's flame burned brighter, a silent acknowledgement. The sun turned to wake his friends. The time for prayer was over. The time for the sacrifice had begun, and the two archangels knew their own assignments were about to be issued. The vigil at the cross was about to start. In a realm far removed from the light of heaven, a different kind of council was called. This was not a place of fire and torment, as so many imagine. It was a place of cold, intelligent darkness, a void of absolute shadow where pride was the only law. At its center sat Lucifer, the fallen star, upon a throne that seemed woven from the very emptiness of space. He was magnificent in his ruin, his brilliance corrupted into a chilling aura of control. He called his council. These were not the lesser spirits that haunted the garden, but the principalities, the powers, the rulers of the darkness of this age. They materialized around him, ancient beings of immense, corrupted wisdom. A cold, thin sound, like the breaking of glass, echoed through the void. It was Lucifer's version of laughter. "It is done," his voice resonated, not in their ears, but directly in their minds. The plan that began in the garden is complete. The prophecy has been broken. The principalities watched him, their own dark light pulsing with anticipation. They had waited for this for millennia. He spoke of a descendant. Lucifer continued, his thoughts laced with contempt. One who would strike the head. For thousands of years we have prepared for a warrior, for an army, for a king who would challenge us with celestial fire. He paused, savoring his perceived triumph. Instead, he sent this, a carpenter, a quiet man of sorrows. He amassed no army, he conquered no throne. And now, he has been captured by his own people, and handed to the Romans. He is condemned. One of the great principalities, a being of pure shadow and legalism, offered its thought. The physical body is compromised, the bloodline ends, the prophecy fails. Precisely. Lucifer affirmed. He believed the prophecy was about a spiritual victory, but I have forced it into a physical conclusion. The man will be removed, the voice will be silenced, the seed will be crushed before it can ever strike. This was Lucifer's great fatal miscalculation. He was a master of legalism, but he could not comprehend grace. He was an expert in power, but he did not understand voluntary submission. He saw the cross, the physical instrument, as his ultimate weapon of disposal. He believed that by using the laws of man to condemn the Son, he was winning a legal victory in the court of heaven. He mistook the instrument of the transaction for the end of the transaction itself. He saw the wood, but not the covenant. He saw a physical end, but not the spiritual beginning. Go, Lucifer commanded his council. Assemble the lower legions. They must not interfere with the humans, for the humans are our unwitting tools. But they will line the path, they will mock, they will jeer. They will add their despair to the air. I want all of hell to witness this final, pathetic conclusion. I want heaven to watch as their champion fails. The shadows bowed, a silent, sickening ripple of obedience, and dissolved back into the darkness. Lucifer remained on his throne, alone. He had played his final card, and he was absolutely, terrifyingly certain that he had won. There was no shadow here. In the high court of heaven, there was only light, sound, and a reality so pure, it was almost overwhelming. But on this day, the infinite light of the realm was heavy. It was a light of profound sorrow, yet underpinned by a resolve that was absolute and eternal. This was the divine accord. The plan, authored before the first star was formed, was now reaching its most critical moment. This was not a reaction to Lucifer's scheme. It was the fulfillment of a promise that Lucifer himself was unknowingly helping to complete. The angelic hosts, countless and radiant, stood in silent awe. They watched as a great, dark cosmos began to form in the center of the celestial court. It was not a physical thing, but a spiritual one. It was not evil itself, but the result of it. This was the weight. It was the spiritual mass of every broken promise, every cruel word, every hidden betrayal, every act of despair and defiance from the first garden until the end of time. It was a quantum of sorrow, a swirling galaxy of human brokenness. It pulsed with a pain that no created being could touch without being utterly consumed. And at the center of this accord was the heart of the Father, a sorrow too deep for any angel to comprehend, yet a love that was deeper still. The plan was not one of defeat. It was not an abandonment. It was an intentional, voluntary act of substitution. The Son, in his pre-incarnate glory, had agreed to this. He had agreed to step out of eternity and into time. He had agreed to take on the fragility of human form, and he had agreed at this precise appointed hour to stand in the place of humanity and take that entire dark cosmos of sin into himself. This was the accord. It was a legal, divine, and incomprehensible transfer. He was not being overcome by Lucifer. He was willingly positioning himself under the weight of all that was wrong, to absorb it, to process it, and to break its power from the inside. The angels of heaven understood their orders. They were not to intervene. They were not to stop the Romans. They were not to silence the crowd. The physical aspect, as terrible as it was merely the container for the spiritual reality. But two angels were given a specific mandate. Michael, the general of the heavenly armies, and Uriel, the light of revelation. They were not being sent to prevent the event. They were being sent to guard it. They were to ensure that the transaction was pure, that no outside demonic force could interfere with the legality of the transfer, and that the fulfillment of the prophecy was witnessed and sealed in all realms. The accord was set, the price was agreed upon, and as the dark spiritual mass of human sin began its slow, terrible descent toward a small hill outside Jerusalem, the heart of heaven watched and waited. The walk began. To the human eye, it was a wretched procession, a common sight in a land under occupation. The sound of the crowd was a chaotic, human noise, a mixture of shouts, weeping, and harsh commands from the soldiers. But in the unseen realm, it was a storm. The spiritual atmosphere over Jerusalem was thick and suffocating. The demonic forces, released by Lucifer's command, swirled through the streets like a foul, dark wind. They did not and could not touch the sun, but they surrounded the procession, clinging to the edges of the crowd. They were spirits of accusation, of fear, and of profound religious pride. They latched onto the shouts of the priests, amplifying their certainty. They fed the anger of the crowd, turning confusion into rage. They hissed and jeered in a language that only the Spirit could hear. "He is finished," they echoed the lie of their master. "The light is fading, darkness wins." The sun walked in the center of this spiritual and physical tempest. He carried the heavy wooden beam, but he also carried the invisible weight of the accord. The dark cosmos of sin, visualized in heaven, was now settling upon his spirit. His exhaustion was profound, a weariness that went far beyond the physical toll. He was already breathing the atmosphere of a separated world. But he was not alone. Two figures moved with the procession, unseen by the crowd and avoided by the demons. Michael and Uriel had taken their positions. Michael moved like a walking fortress. His presence was a perimeter of divine authority. He was not there to stop the humans. Their role, though tragic, was part of the path. He was there to stop interference. As the demonic forces tried to press closer, to launch a direct spiritual accusation at the Son in his moment of distress, they hit the invisible wall of Michael's presence and recoiled in terror. He was the silent, glowering sentinel, his hand on his sword, ensuring this transaction would not be corrupted. Uriel moved beside him, a column of pure, contained light. He was the guardian of the purpose. While Michael guarded the person, Uriel guarded the meaning. His fiery presence was a beacon, cutting through the demonic darkness. He was the divine scribe, and his gaze was fixed on the Son, observing and recording every moment, not for history, but for eternity. He ensured that this act of submission was being sealed into the very fabric of reality, a legal testimony that could never be challenged. The procession moved slowly. The soldiers pushed, the crowd jeered, the demons hissed, and through it all the Son walked, his every step a fulfillment of the plan. Michael held the spiritual line. Uriel illuminated the divine truth. The hill was approaching, Golgotha, the place of the skull. In the unseen realm, it was the place of the final transaction. The stage was set, the guardians were in place, and all of heaven held its breath. The hill known as Golgotha shuddered. A final, heavy sound echoed across the dusty ground as the wooden beam was set into the earth. It was not a sound of finality, but of commencement. It was the sound of a cosmic anchor being dropped, fixing this single point in time and space as the pivot upon which all of eternity would turn. In the physical realm, it was the grim work of exhausted soldiers. In the spiritual realm, it was a signal that pierced the dimensions, a clear, ringing note that all of heaven and all of hell heard with absolute clarity. The moment had come. In that instant, Michael ceased his pacing. For hours, his movement in the etheric plane had been a vibration of contained anxiety, a warrior's fury held in check by a divine command. Now, that anxiety was gone. replaced by a cold, dreadful purpose. His spiritual form solidified, rooting itself to that spot. He did not just become an unmoving mountain, he became a living banner of heaven's unyielding authority. His very presence was a declaration that this ground was now consecrated, sealed by a power that preceded the world's foundation. The very air around him crystallized, and the demonic entities, still hissing from the procession, felt the agonizing burn of pure, unadulterated holiness. His eyes, burning with a contained celestial fire, scanned the unseen realm, a silent warning. On the opposite side of the hill, Uriel did the same. But where Michael was a fortress of unyielding force, Uriel was a pillar of unwavering truth. He did not become a mountain, but a column of analytical, white-hot fire. His presence was the banner of divine revelation. He was the witness, the scribe, the illuminator of the event. His light was not a weapon, but a lens, a divine notary's gaze that began to observe and record every microsecond of the transaction. He was not there to guard, but to validate. His fire was the seal of truth that would make this act eternally incontestable. The space between the two archangels, with the sun at its precise center, became a sealed, divine zone. It was a sanctuary of the transaction. The demonic legions that had swarmed the procession, hissing their accusations and fear, were suddenly and violently repelled. They had surged forward, expecting to feast on the despair of this final moment. Instead, they hit the invisible wall of Michael's authority and the pure analytical fire of Uriel. They were thrown back as if hitting a wall of glass, their shadowy forms searing at the edges where they touched the holy perimeter. They could not cross. They could only watch from a distance, their confusion turning to a frantic, impotent rage. They had been invited to a spectacle, only to find themselves outside a locked and guarded cathedral. The two banners were planted. The spiritual stage was set. The transaction was about to begin. Lucifer observed the new perimeter with cold curiosity. He stood from his throne of shadows, projecting his consciousness across the dimensions to the hill. He saw the banners of Michael and Uriel, and a ripple of amusement passed through his ancient consciousness. He recognized the divine seal, but he misinterpreted its purpose. He believed they were there not as facilitators, but as jailers. He believed heaven was quarantining its own failure. In his arrogance, he saw the perimeter not as a sanctuary for the sun, but as a final wall of abandonment, caging him with the sin of the world. He could no longer approach to interfere, but that did not matter. His weapon was not interference, it was the law. This, he believed, was his grand courtroom, and the entire universe was the jury. He began his legal proclamation. He did not shout. He broadcast his thoughts across the dimensions, a cold, precise tenor that vibrated in the minds of every principality and power. It was the confident, systematic presentation of a master prosecutor who knew he had an ironclad case. He presented the evidence. A vast spiritual ledger unrolled in the unseen realm, projected by his own dark will. It was not a scroll of paper, but a swirling cosmos of every broken promise, every secret corruption, every act of defiance from the first garden until this very moment. It was the comprehensive, undeniable proof of a failed creation. "Behold," his thought voice declared, resonating even in the fearful hearts of the humans below, though they knew not what they heard. "The law is broken. The covenant of innocence is shattered. The debt is absolute." Oh! His accusation, a finger of pure shadow, pointed toward the sun. "He stands with them. He is judged by them. And now he shall fall with them. He is condemned by his own. He is counted among the transgressors. The law itself finds him forfeit. He has failed to uphold the standard." Lucifer began to list the great spiritual debts of the nations, the secret corruptions of kings, the hidden darkness in the hearts of all people. He was systematic. He was relentless. He was proving in his own corrupted mind that the debt was too great, that the divine experiment was a failure, and that the one sent to redeem it was now himself trapped by its consequences. He was arguing that the Son, by being condemned under human law, was now legally bound by the consequences of all human law. He was presenting his case that all of creation, and now its supposed Redeemer, was his by right of broken law. He believed this was his checkmate. He had waited millennia to present this case, and now the defendant was silent and bound, flanked by guards who, in Lucifer's mind, were only there to watch him fail. In the high courts of heaven there was no song. The great celestial choirs, whose voices sustained the music of the spheres, were utterly silent. The first hour on the hill was defined by a profound, agonizing stillness that was heavier and more terrible than any sound. It was a silence not of absence, but of unbearable, restrained presence. Legions of angels, numbering beyond human comprehension, watched the scene unfold from the battlements of eternity. They were warriors, guardians, and worshippers. Their entire existence was built on two pillars, adoring the Word who had spoken them into being and defending the honor of his throne. Now they were forced to watch as that same Word, their Creator, was subjected to the ultimate mockery by the very world he had made. It was a suffering that defied their angelic understanding. It was a paradox that threatened to unravel their very nature. That nature screamed for intervention. Theirs was a righteous fury, a white-hot, holy indignation. A single whispered command from the Son, a single permissive nod of permission from the Father, and a billion swords of light would have descended. It would not have been a battle. It would have been an unmaking. In less than the blink of a human eye, the hill would have vanished, the soldiers turned to dust, and the entire spectacle ended in a single instant of divine judgment. But the command did not come. The silence from the Son, his refusal to summon them, was, in itself, the order. It was the most difficult command they had ever been asked to obey, and so they watched, and they waited. For Michael, this silence was the loudest battle he had ever fought. He stood as an unmoving banner, a fortress of divine authority. But inside his spiritual form was a universe of contained force. He was the general of the heavenly armies, and he was being commanded to watch. This was an assault on his very essence. His grip on the hilt of his still-sheathed sword was so immense that it radiated waves of pure power, causing the very air around him on the hill to warp and shimmer. He was a lion on a divine leash, straining against a mandate he could not fully comprehend, but which he would obey. His obedience was a physical, spiritual force. He was not just restraining himself, he was the dam, holding back the righteous fury of the entire heavenly host by his example. If he moved, heaven would move. And so, he remained perfectly, painfully still. His mandate was clear. Hold the line. Do not interfere. Not yet. It was the 6th hour. The sun, a creation of the very one now suspended in its light, was at its absolute apex. It blazed down on the hill with a harsh, unforgiving intensity, a stark, pitiless spotlight on the human mockery below. The air was dry, hot, and thick with the dust of the crowd. Then the light began to fail. It did not fade gently, as it does at dusk. It was not a slow creeping of shadows. It was an extinguishing. A profound, unnatural darkness, a cold and absolute shadow, fell over the land. It was as if a great cosmic hand had simply snuffed out the Sunday. The light was gone. This was not an astronomical event. This was not a cloud. This was a spiritual mandate. The jeering of the crowd, which had been a constant, chaotic noise, faltered. Shouts turned to confused murmurs, and then to terrified whispers. The soldiers, men hardened to the spectacles of the empire, looked up, their faces pale with a sudden, superstitious fear. This was a darkness they had never seen, a cold that had nothing to do with the absence of heat. The world was plunged into a terrifying twilight, and a cold wind, a wind that seemed to come from nowhere, swept across the hill. This darkness was an act of Uriel. The archangel of revelation, the flame of God, was now acting as the guardian of a divine mystery. He extended his will. He was not a warrior like Michael, acting with force. He was a keeper, acting with purpose. He drew a veil across the face of the Sunday. This was, in part, an act of mercy. It was a divine curtain drawn to shield the cosmos and even the angelic hosts from witnessing the full, unveiled, spiritual suffering of the Son taking on the weight of the world's sin. It was a moment too terrible, too holy, for unfiltered creation to observe. But it was also a sign. It was the physical manifestation of the great paradox. The divine order was being inverted. The light of the world was now taking on all the darkness of the world. The shadow that fell was both a veil and a symbol. In this moment, the physical world was being forced to reflect the spiritual reality. Uriel, the analytical fire of God, understood this. He was not just hiding the event. He was veiling the Holy of Holies, the ultimate mystery of the atonement, as it happened. In the supernatural darkness, Michael's presence became even more pronounced to the unseen realm. He was a sentinel of fire in a world without light. This divine darkness, commanded by Uriel, did not impede his vision, it clarified it. Physical light was a distraction. Now, he saw only the raw spiritual truth. He saw the swirling, terrified forms of the demonic legions held at bay. He saw the blinding, analytical light of his brother, Uriel. And he saw the sun, a point of pure, pained focus, now beginning to draw all the darkness of the world into himself. His mandate was precise. It was not to be a bodyguard against the physical actions of the soldiers. Their part, though born of ignorance and cruelty, was a necessary component of the prophecy. He was not there to answer the accusations of the priests, whose loud shouts were now just fearful whispers in the cold dark. He was there to guard the transaction. What was happening on that hill, hidden by the dark, was the single most important legal transaction in the history of the universe. That swirling cosmos of human failure, the one visualized in heaven, the one Lucifer was still itemizing in his spiritual court, was now converging. It was a spiritual vortex, a deluge of spiritual poison and debt from all of history, past, present, and future. And it was all being drawn, by the Son's own will, onto him. This was the moment. The full crushing weight of the accord was being transferred. Lucifer's accusations, which he thought were his victory, were now being paid. Michael, the warrior, now served as the divine enforcer of the covenant. He was the armed guardian of the treasury. His job was to ensure that this transfer was total, pure, and uninterrupted. No demon could be allowed to interfere. No principality could be allowed to challenge the exchange. The demonic forces, sensing the massive shift in spiritual power, were pressing against the barrier, desperate to corrupt the payment. But Michael's presence was the wall. His sword was not drawn to attack, but to enforce. He was the guardian of the covenant, ensuring the price was accepted and paid in full. He held the line, a silent, burning wall between the transaction and the forces of hell. Where Michael's presence was a shield of unyielding force, Uriel's was a lens of unbearable clarity. He was the flame of God, the archangel of divine mystery, and his purpose on that hill was entirely different from his brothers. Michael was the warrior, the guardian of the process. But Uriel was the scribe, the guardian of the meaning. His light, a column of pure white fire, did not fight the supernatural darkness that Uriel himself had veiled over the land. Instead, his light pierced through it. He was not there to restrain demons, for that was Michael's domain. He was there to ensure that what was happening was recorded in the very fabric of eternity, that this sacrifice could never be misinterpreted, challenged, or undone by any future lie. In the spiritual realm, the great accord was unfolding. The swirling dark cosmos of humanity's failures, that vast heavy mass of sin, was now being fully transferred onto the Son. This was the transaction Michael was guarding, but Uriel was validating the payment. His fiery gaze was fixed upon the Spirit of the Son. He was the divine auditor, the keeper of the scroll, and in the unseen realm, a great spiritual scroll of the covenant, the very one authored before time began, was now being fulfilled. Lucifer's accusations, which were still echoing from a distance, were based on the old law, the law of cause and effect, of sin and consequence. But Uriel was the witness to a new divine logic. He watched as the full toxic weight of the world's sin settled upon the Spirit of the Son. He watched as that perfect, unblemished Spirit accepted the weight, absorbing the totality of the poison, and Uriel's fire, which consumes all untruth, tested that Spirit. This was the great mystery. The Son was not just bearing sin, he was becoming the vessel for it, yet his own essence remained perfectly, divinely pure. It was a paradox that hell could not comprehend. He was absorbing the darkness without the darkness absorbing him. Uriel's function was to seal this truth. His light, the flame of revelation, was the divine ink. He was etching this moment, this impossible transaction, into the laws of the universe. He was countersigning the divine accord. While Michael stood as a wall, Uriel stood as a beacon. His light ensured that this sacrifice was not a tragedy, but a judgment. It was the judgment of sin itself. He ensured that the meaning of this event would ripple forward and backward through time. It was this light of truth that would one day illuminate the minds of the prophets and apostles. It was this sealed, validated meaning that would become the foundation of the new covenant. Lucifer, watching from his shadows, could not understand Uriel's fire. He saw it only as light, but it was a revelation. It was the very truth of God, bearing witness that the price was being paid in full by the only one who could pay it. Michael's silence was a roar of restrained power. Uriel's silence was the profound, focused work of sealing the greatest legal document in cosmic history. The warrior held the perimeter. The scribe finalized the treaty. For 3 hours, the unnatural darkness had suffocated the land. The only sounds were the low murmurs of the terrified soldiers, the distant, muffled weeping of the women, and the labored breathing from the center of the hill. Then it came. A voice from the central figure cried out. It was a cry that tore through the physical air, a sound of profound human suffering and desolation. My God, why have you forsaken me? To the human ear, it was the ultimate question of despair. It was the sound of a broken man, abandoned by all, including his God. The soldiers misunderstood it. The distant crowd heard it as the final, desperate gasp of a failed prophet. Even Lucifer, in his cold, dark realm, heard it, and for a fleeting instant, believed his victory was absolute. He heard it as the sound of the divine accord breaking. He believed the Father had turned his face away, that the Son was truly forsaken, that the separation was permanent. He believed the prophecy had been undone by the sheer, unbearable weight of the sin he had authored. He was wrong. In the unseen realm, this cry was not a question, it was a summons. It was not a cry of defeat, it was a declaration of completion. The moment the sound left the Son's lips, it did not just travel through the air, it pierced dimensions. It struck the high courts of heaven, not as a plea for help, but as a signal. The legions of angels, who had been straining in silence for hours, heard it and understood. The price was paid. The lowest point had been reached. The full, awful weight of the separation had been endured. The cry plunged deeper. It shot down into the foundations of the world, into the very gates of Sheol, the realm of the dead. It was not the whisper of another soul arriving in that shadowy place. It was a seismic shockwave. It was the sound of a conqueror announcing his imminent arrival. The ancient, unseen gates of death and Hades, gates that had held humanity captive for millennia, trembled and vibrated, not from an attack, but from the resonance of a power they had never before encountered. And then Lucifer felt it. He felt the true terror. He had watched the transaction, believing he was the prosecutor in a trial, but as that cry echoed, he watched the spiritual realm react. He saw Michael, who should have looked defeated, instead tighten his grip on his sword, his stance shifting from guarding to preparing. He saw Uriel's flame, which should have been extinguished, instead erupt with a brilliant, blinding intensity, the light of a truth sealed. Lucifer finally understood. The cry was not the sound of the accord breaking. It was the sound of the accord being fulfilled. The Son had endured it all. He had taken the full weight, the total separation, the entire cosmic debt, and he had survived it. The debt was paid. The ledger that Lucifer had presented in the spiritual court was now, in an instant, wiped clean, validated by Uriel's fire. The cry was the signal that the transaction was finished. And for Lucifer, the pang of true, cold fear was this: if the Son could absorb all of sin and endure the divine absence, what would he do next? He had been outmaneuvered. The prophecy had not been about the Son avoiding the fall, but about him enduring it and conquering it from within. The war was not over. It had just truly begun. At the very same instant that the great cry of completion echoed from Golgotha, another event took place. Miles away, in the heart of Jerusalem, the temple stood in solemn, ritualistic silence. Inside its sacred courts, priests went about their duties, oblivious to the cosmic shift occurring just beyond the city walls. They were shielded from the supernatural darkness, existing within the bubble of their ancient traditions. At the very heart of this magnificent building lay the Holy of Holies, the most sacred place on earth, and separating it from the rest of the temple was the veil. This was not a simple curtain. It was a massive, heavy tapestry, woven with threads of blue, purple, and scarlet. It was as thick as a man's hand, a formidable barrier. But its physical properties were nothing compared to its spiritual significance. In the unseen realm, this veil was not fabric. It was a wall of divine law. It was the physical representation of the separation between a holy God and a fallen humanity. For centuries, this barrier had been guarded. Mighty angelic beings, cherubim of the Old Covenant, stood watch before it. Their mandate was absolute, to enforce the separation, to ensure that no unholiness could pass into the pure presence of the Most High. But they too heard the cry from Golgotha. It was the signal they had awaited since the foundation of the temple. From his position on the hill, Michael, the great archangel, did not move. He did not need to. He simply acknowledged the signal. It was an invisible command, a spiritual nod of release sent from the general to his garrison. In the temple, the guardian cherubim understood. For the first time in ages, their grim watch was over. Their swords of fire, which had enforced the law of separation, were lowered. They stepped aside. Their mandate, the guarding of the Old Covenant, was fulfilled. The moment their spiritual authority was withdrawn, the barrier was no longer just fabric. The immense, contained power within the Holy of Holies, the very presence that the veil was meant to contain, now had no barrier. A soundless, spiritual explosion detonated from within the sacred room. The massive veil did not rip gently. It was torn in two, from the top to the bottom. It was an act of divine finality. The old system was broken, not by man, but by God himself. The barrier was gone. The way was now and forever open. Back on the hill, the supernatural darkness held its breath. The echo of the great cry still hung in the heavy air. The transaction was complete. The veil was torn. The full, awful weight of the accord had been met. The Son, having endured the totality of the separation, now spoke his final words from that place of suffering. His voice was not the shout of pain that had come before. It was a clear, certain declaration, spoken with an authority that vibrated through both the natural and the spiritual worlds. It is finished. 3 words. To the soldiers below it was a whisper, a final breath of a man at his end. To the weeping followers at a distance, it was the sound of a mission ending in failure. But in the unseen realm, those 3 words were a roar. In the high courts of heaven, it was the shout of a triumphant king. It was the legal proclamation that the debt was paid, the treaty was signed. The prophecy was fulfilled. The legions of angels, who had been held in agonizing silence, heard that proclamation, and a wave of pure, thunderous adoration erupted from the heavenly host. For Lucifer, those 3 words were his sentence. As the declaration, "It is finished," radiated from the Son, it was not just sound. It was pure, unfiltered, victorious truth. It was a shockwave of divine light. The demonic principalities that still lingered at the edge of Michael's perimeter, the ones who had been jeering and accusing, were struck by this wave. They could not exist in the presence of this truth. The energy of the completed redemption was like fire to them. The closest ranks of these dark spirits were not just repelled, they were dissolved, undone by the sheer holy power of the finished work. On his pillar of fire, Uriel heard the words and saw the spiritual effect. He, the divine scribe, raised his hand. The great scroll of the covenant, the one he had been witnessing, was now complete. He impressed upon it the final seal of divine truth, a seal that could never be broken. The transaction was not just complete, it was witnessed, ratified, and filed in the archives of eternity. It was, legally and spiritually, done. And then, having sealed the victory, the Son completed his final act of submission. He bowed his head. He had held on to his life through the suffering, and now he willingly released his spirit. The instant the Son's spirit was released, the universe registered its completion. The great spiritual transaction was now fully executed, and creation itself, the physical world that had been groaning under the darkness, finally reacted. A violent shudder seized the land. The very ground of Golgotha, the place of the skull, began to heave. This was not a normal tremor. This was a groan from the very foundations of the earth. The planet was reacting to the profound cosmic paradox of the event. The author of life had willingly passed from it. The rocks around the 3 wooden beams split apart. The ground beneath the soldiers' feet cracked, and they fell in terror, shouting in a language of fear that all could understand. The supernatural darkness its purpose served began to thin, but the air was now filled with dust and the sound of a world in agony. From his distant throne of shadows, Lucifer witnessed it all. He had heard the cry, he had seen the veil in the spiritual realm tear, he had heard the final proclamation, "It is finished," and he had felt the earth itself tremble in response. In that single horrifying moment, the full truth collapsed upon him. He finally understood his fatal miscalculation. He had believed he was the prosecutor, winning his legal case against the Son. He thought he was the mastermind, using the Romans and the priests as his pawns. He was wrong. He was not the prosecutor. He was the tool. His own accusations, the itemized list of humanity's failures, were the very instruments heaven had used to legally load the sin onto the Son. His attempt to use the law to condemn was the very mechanism that allowed the law to be fulfilled. He had not outwitted the prophecy. He had walked directly into it. He had not crushed the seed. He had merely bruised the heel, and in doing so, had guaranteed the striking of his own head. He was not the victor. He was the unwitting servant of the divine accord. The horror of this realization was absolute. He, the star of the morning, the master of pride, had been reduced to a pawn in a plan so vast he could not even comprehend its borders. His consciousness recoiled from the hill. He fled from the sight of Michael, who now stood at ease, his hand off his sword. He fled from the searing light of Uriel, who had recorded his eternal defeat. Lucifer did not just retreat, he fled, disappearing back into the deepest void of his own shadows, his certainty shattered, his triumph turned to ash. And on the hill, after the tremor, a new silence fell. It was not the strained silence of waiting. It was the cold, heavy, profound silence of the grave. The battle for the debt was over. The transaction was complete, and the king was gone. On the hill of Golgotha, the physical form remained silent. The tremor had ceased, and the cold, heavy stillness of the grave had settled over the land. To the human eye, the story was over. The movement had stopped. But in the realm of the spirit, the true movement had just begun. The spirit of the Son, having willingly released itself from its earthly vessel, did not fade. It did not drift. It did not sleep. It acted. It descended. This was not the reluctant fall of a defeated soul being dragged into the shadow. This was the intentional, powerful stride of a king stepping into a new domain to claim it. He was not a victim being taken by the underworld. He was a conqueror arriving to claim his spoils. His spiritual form was unbound, radiant with the power of the completed transaction. He still bore the echo of the immense weight he had carried, but it was no longer a burden. It was a testament. It was the proof of his victory. And he did not descend alone. Michael, the great archangel, the general of heaven, finally, slowly, sheathed his sword. The immense strain of his 3-hour vigil, holding back the fury of heaven, was replaced by a blazing, profound reverence. His mandate of guarding the transaction was complete. His new mandate was escorting the victor. He fell into step behind his king, a sentinel of pure, concentrated power, his presence a silent warning to the realms of shadow they were about to enter. Beside him, Uriel, the flame of revelation, moved as well. His light, which had been a focused, analytical beacon sealing the truth of the covenant, now shifted. It ceased to be a static pillar of witness and became a traveling Sunday. His role as the divine scribe was finished. Now he was the herald, the illuminator, the one who would carry the light of the finished work into the oldest darkness. The three of them moved. The king, the warrior, and the witness. They passed through the veil of the physical world, moving deeper than the foundations of the rock that had just split. They were a procession of pure light, a divine spearhead aimed at the very heart of the realm of the dead. Where were they going? They were descending into Sheol. This was the great, ancient waiting place of souls. It was not the final destination of torment, nor was it the final kingdom of glory. It was the vast, dim, shadowy echo of the world above, the collective holding place for all who had passed from life since the first breath in the first garden. It was a kingdom of stillness, of memory, and of profound separation. And this kingdom was divided. On one side, there was a place of gray, restless twilight. Here, the spirits of those who had followed the dictates of their own hearts, those who had lived without faith in the divine promise, existed in a dim and weary state. They were tormented not by active fire, but by the cold, heavy weight of their own choices, by unfulfilled desires, and by the suffocating absence of true light. On the other side, separated by a great, impassable chasm of spiritual law, was a place of quiet peace. It was often called the bosom of Abraham. This was not heaven, but it was a protected enclave, a garden of serene hope. Here, the righteous waited. Abraham, Sarah, David, and all those who had lived by faith in a promise they had never seen fulfilled, they rested here. They were at peace, but they were still captives of hope, waiting for the day of their liberation. This entire realm, in all its parts, existed in an unchanging, perpetual state of waiting. Nothing ever changed in Sheol. Until now. The moment the sun, flanked by Michael and Uriel, breached the outer borders of this ancient domain, the entire dimension convulsed. It was a shockwave that was not sound, but a feeling. In the realms of twilight, the restless spirits shrieked in terror. This was a light they had never seen, a purity that was painful to their shadowy nature. It was not an attack, it was a simple presence, but that presence was unbearable. They fled, trying to burrow into deeper, impossible shadows, hiding from the radiant truth that had just walked through their gates. But in the bosom of Abraham, the reaction was the opposite. A sudden, impossible warmth spread through the garden of waiting. A light, brighter than any memory of the sun, began to dawn on their spiritual horizon. The spirits of the faithful, the patriarchs and prophets, began to stir. Their long, patient rest was broken by a sudden, trembling, electric elation. They did not yet know what it was, but they knew who it was. The promise had come. The sun did not pause at the border. He moved with the calm, measured authority of a king walking through his own halls. He was not a spirit in prison. He was the king visiting the prisoners. He walked first, not to the realm of twilight, but toward the garden of the righteous. The great chasm that no spirit could cross was no barrier to him. He walked across it as if it were solid ground. As he moved, Uriel, the flame of God, fulfilled his new purpose. His light, which had been a traveling sun, now flared with intention. It ceased to be just a light and became a message. It was a fire of pure revelation that carried no sound, yet every spirit in that garden understood it in their very core. Uriel's light illuminated the truth. The waiting spirits of the faithful were bathed in this revelation, and in an instant they saw the hill of Golgotha. They saw the divine accord. They saw the supernatural darkness, the tearing of the veil, and the final proclamation. They understood for the first time what their entire lives of faith had been pointing toward. They saw that the Son had not just arrived, he had arrived by way of the cross. He had just completed the very transaction that their sacrifices had only foreshadowed. The light of Uriel showed them the completed covenant, the one Michael had guarded and the one Uriel himself had just sealed. Then, as the spirits of Abraham, David, and all the righteous prophets stood in stunned, joyous awe, the Son spoke. His voice was not the cry of pain from the hill, it was the voice of the Word, the sound that had spoken creation into existence. He did not speak of the pain he had endured, he spoke of the work he had finished. He declared to these captives of hope that their captivity was over. He announced that the ancient prophecy was fulfilled, that the debt was paid, that the barrier between humanity and God was gone, and that the way home, the way to the true heaven, was now and forever open. A wave of pure joy, a sound of release that had been held back for thousands of years, erupted from the spirits of the righteous. They were no longer waiting. They were no longer prisoners of hope. They were the liberated. And they gathered around their king, their forms, once dim with waiting, now glowing with his reflected light. This was not just a visit, it was a jailbreak. The procession of the liberated was formed. The spirits of the righteous, glowing now with a light that was not their own, gathered behind their king. Abraham, David, the prophets, and countless faithful souls who had waited in the garden of hope were now a vast, joyous assembly. But they were still within the borders of Sheol. The main gates of the underworld, the ancient doors of finality, still stood before them. They moved from the bosom of Abraham, across the now meaningless chasm, and approached the great outer boundary of the realm of the dead. These gates were not made of physical iron or stone. They were spiritual constructs. They were barriers forged from the ancient law of sin and consequence. They were the very definition of the end. They were the final, unyielding statement that all who entered this shadowy domain would never leave. Ancient, powerful spiritual entities, principalities of shadow older than any human empire, stood as sentinels before them. As the procession of light approached, these dark sentinels recoiled. They had never witnessed such a sight. They were accustomed to the weary, defeated, singular spirits of the dead. They were not prepared for a radiant, conquering king leading an army of the liberated. The gates remained shut. They were sealed by a law that had, until this moment, been absolute. Michael, the great warrior archangel, stepped forward to the head of the procession. His sword was now fully drawn, not to strike the gates, but to announce the presence of a new, higher authority. His presence was a legal challenge to the old law. Uriel, the flame of revelation, moved beside him. His light did not strike the gates, but illuminated them, revealing what they truly were, a barrier built upon the paid debt. His light exposed the fact that their legal foundation was now gone. Then the Son, the King, spoke. He did not shout, he did not push. He simply addressed the ancient barriers with the voice that had spoken the stars into existence. He gave the command that the prophets had foretold. "Lift up your heads, O you gates." His voice resonated, not with sound, but with pure, irresistible authority. "Be lifted up, you everlasting doors, and the King of glory shall come in." The dark sentinels trembled, their forms dissolving in the raw presence of his power. And the gates themselves, their legal claim nullified, their foundation erased by the finished work on the hill, could not withstand the command. They did not explode, they did not break, they dissolved. They unraveled like mist in a new dawn, the ancient law of separation simply ceasing to exist in the presence of the one who had fulfilled it. The shattering was not a sound of violence. It was a profound, cosmic silence of an old reality giving way to a new one. The path was now clear. The everlasting doors were gone. The great assembly of the righteous stood on the threshold, ready to ascend. But the Son paused. One final act of authority was required. From the deepest void, from the very center of the now defeated realm, a final shadow gathered. It was not a being like Lucifer, full of pride and intellect. This was something older, more primal. It was the formless, cold, sentient absence. This was the very essence of death itself, the final consequence, the entity that held the ultimate power of the old law. It did not speak, but it radiated a final, cold question. By what right? It was the last, desperate challenge to his authority, the claim that the physical realm still belonged to the shadow. This was the moment of the great transfer. This was not a negotiation. Uriel, the keeper of the mysteries, stepped forward. His form, a column of white fire, pulsed with blinding intensity. He projected the divine record, the sealed scroll of the covenant that he had witnessed and validated on Golgotha. The light projected the truth for all, even this ancient shadow, to see. The price was paid. The accord was finished. The legal claim of sin was satisfied. Michael, the warrior of heaven, stepped forward. He did not point his sword at the shadow. He pointed his sword at Uriel's projected record. He was the divine enforcer, the military witness, attesting in the spiritual court that the record was true and that the verdict was now absolute. The old law was satisfied. the new law was in effect. The shadow of death, confronted by the inescapable proof of its own defeat, recoiled, its very essence weakened, its authority draining away. The Son stretched out his hand. He was not asking, he was not pleading, he was taking. From the heart of the fading, formless shadow, two sigils of immense power began to emerge. They were not physical keys, but spiritual symbols of absolute dominion, glowing with an ancient cold light. The key of Hades, the authority over the realm and the spirits within it, and the key of death, the power over the final separation itself. They were not taken by force, they were drawn by the irresistible, magnetic pull of the one who had conquered them. They moved from the shadow and into the light, settling into the open hand of the king. He closed his hand. The transfer was complete. The ancient shadow, now disarmed and stripped of its ultimate power, dissolved back into the void from which it came. It was not annihilated, but its reign was broken. The Son, the King of Glory, now held the keys. The victory was total. The king turned to the vast, waiting assembly of the liberated. He had proclaimed their freedom. He had cleared their path. He now held the very keys to their former prison. He turned and began to move, leading the way out of the last vestiges of the shadow. The great procession, the jailbreak of the righteous, began. They ascended. It was a river of light, a joyous, triumphant exodus moving up from the depths of the world, leaving the realm of waiting and shadow far behind. The sound of their joy, a sound of praise that had been held back for thousands of years, echoed through the spiritual dimensions. Michael and Uriel took their places as the honor guard, flanking the immense procession. The warrior and the witness, their vigil in the depths now complete, escorted the first fruits of the victory home. The Son led the spirits of Abraham, of David, of all the faithful, not back to the garden of waiting, but upward, to the true gates of the high heavens, to the very presence of the Father. And simultaneously, back in the physical realm, the world was cold. On the small hill outside Jerusalem, the three wooden beams stood empty and stark against the night sky. In a nearby garden, a new tomb, borrowed from a wealthy follower, was sealed with a massive, heavy stone. Roman soldiers, weary and cold, stood their watch. They were guarding a tomb, certain that the story was over. The third day began. A single pale gray line of light appeared on the eastern horizon. It was a normal sunrise, just like any other. But in the unseen realm, this new light was different. It was the first dawn of a new creation. In the garden, invisible to the sleepy guards, the two archangels had returned. Their mission was not yet finished. Michael stood on one side of the sealed tomb. Uriel stood on the other. They were no longer the strange sentinels of the transaction, nor the honor guard of the descent. They were now the silent, expectant guardians of the final promise. They had witnessed the spiritual victory. They had seen the gates dissolve. They had watched their king seize the keys of death and had escorted the liberated home. Now they waited. They stood watch over the silent tomb, awaiting the final, physical fulfillment of the divine accord. The first light of the new day washed over the great stone, and all of heaven held its breath, awaiting the moment when the victory won in the unseen depths would erupt into the visible world. Here are some personal reflections on the story we have just explored. When we look at this story, what is truly profound is not the struggle we can see with our eyes, but the immense, invisible architecture of the divine plan. We see a hill of suffering, but just beyond the veil, we see a cosmic transaction, a legal and spiritual masterpiece being executed with perfect precision. It teaches us that what our eyes perceive as chaos or defeat is often, in the unseen realm, a moment of profound, controlled purpose. We can feel the agonizing tension of Michael. He is the great warrior, the general of heaven, and his entire being screamed to intervene. Yet his greatest act of strength, his most difficult battle, was his obedience to remain silent. It shows us that true loyalty is not just fighting for a cause, but sometimes it is waiting for it. Then we see Uriel, the quiet flame. He holds no sword, but he is just as powerful. He is the guardian of the meaning. He represents the eternal truth that no matter how dark or chaotic the event, that truth is being recorded and the purpose is being sealed. And the Son, his power is the most challenging for us to understand. It is not the power to summon armies, which he had, but the profound power to endure. His victory was secured not by unleashing his might upon his accusers, but by fulfilling his mission, even when it meant descending into the darkest, quietest places. The lesson for us, for you listening right now, is this. You may be in a moment that feels like Golgotha. You may be surrounded by the noise of accusation. You may feel the chill of a supernatural darkness, and you may feel that you are completely alone. But this story reminds us that you are not. It reminds us that your greatest moments of strength may not be when you are shouting, but when you are simply enduring. Your patience, your quiet obedience, your refusal to give up, that may be your loudest and most important battle. In your darkest hour, there is a plan that you cannot see. Just as Michael and Uriel were present at that hill, there is a divine, unseen reality at work in your life. Your moment of struggle is not for nothing. It is not the end of the story. Like the king, you may be on a path that requires a descent before the ascent. So, hold on, trust the unseen. Your greatest victory is often sealed in the very moments that feel the most like defeat. If this story touched your heart, please give this video a like. It helps the light reach others who may need it. Share your thoughts and reflections in the comments below. I would love to hear what part spoke to you most. And if you wish to continue this journey of quiet stories, faith, and healing, subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next chapter. May the light stay with you, always.